Hi everyone, welcome back to Story of the World chapter highlights. I'm Sophie teacher and today we're going to be talking about chapter 12 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now today there are two main parts of our chapter. The first part is focused in Ireland and the second part is focused in South Africa. What I really want you to think about when you're reading both of these chapters is to think about how the British were responsible in both of these cases in a negative way. How were they responsible and what did they do in each of those countries? Also think about the lasting impact that is left on both of these countries, because both of these things have been linked to still very recent issues and conflict. So let's get started. At the very start of our chapter today, like I said, we're in Ireland. Now, the issues between the British and Irish go back a very long time. In 1541, King Henry VIII was on the throne of England. Now, King Henry VIII was very famous for starting the Church of England. He did this, lots of people say he did this because divorce was not allowed in the Catholic Church and the Pope wouldn't let him divorce. So he really wanted to be Protestant and have Protestantism in England. So that's what he decided to do. Now, in 1541, he decided he wanted Ireland. He wanted the whole island to himself. Now, they're very close to each other. You've probably seen this map before. And that's what Henry did. Ireland was Catholic, and there's still a lot of Catholics in Ireland. So this caused a big problem when the Protestant king decided to force this Protestantism onto the Catholics in Ireland. Now, we're going to skip a lot of time and go to 1801. This is how long these issues have been going on for. Now, in 1801, the English Parliament decided they didn't want Parliament in Ireland anymore, and they dissolved or got rid of Parliament in Ireland, which meant that there was no longer a domestic government in Ireland. Irish people were angry about this, of course, and thought, where are our rights? What rights do we have if we have no government to speak for us? At this time, lots of Ireland was starting to be owned by English landlords, including a lot of the farmland. So the farmland would be owned by English landlords and have Irish farmers working on it. Now, if we go a little bit into the future, 40 years later, in 1845, there was a deadly disease for plants spreading across Europe. It was specifically targeting potatoes and causing huge issues with potato crops across Europe. Now, this was really scary for the Irish. This disease hadn't reached Ireland yet, but they were very concerned because in Ireland, they grew mainly two types of crops. They grew wheat and oats, which was always sent to England. It was sent to England for the English to eat. And they grew potatoes. The potatoes were for the Irish. They were grown for the Irish. They could keep them and eat them. So when they heard about this disease hitting potatoes, they started to think, what if that comes to Ireland? We're not going to have any food to eat. And unfortunately for Ireland, that is what happened. In 1845, the disease came to Ireland and they named it the Blight. The Blight killed potatoes and ruined the crop. And that's what started the potato famine of Ireland. One of the really big issues here was that even though lots of the Irish were starving, the England still insisted that the crops of wheat and oat were sent to England. At this time, Robert Peel was the Prime Minister of England. Robert Peel was concerned with what was happening in Ireland, and he didn't agree with it. And he wanted to do something about this law. This law was the Corn Law. The Corn Law meant that any food bought from abroad, coming into Ireland or into England, would have huge taxes on it. This was a big problem for the Irish because not only did they not have any food, they didn't have enough money to pay those taxes, which meant even though they had no crops of their own, they couldn't even afford to get the food from abroad. So Robert Peel wanted to get rid of the Corn Laws, and he went to the British Parliament and he told them, but they refused. They refused to end the Corn Laws, even though more and more people were dying in Ireland. As time passed, finally the blight ended in 1850. But by this time, Ireland had been decimated. 1 million Irish people had died, and over 1 million more had moved to other countries, including around 800,000 to America, which is why America has such a large Irish population now. This issue still went on, and in 1886, William Gladstone, the new Prime Minister of England, decided he wanted to do something with Ireland and introduced the Home Rule Bill. He wanted this bill so that Ireland could be more responsible for their domestic government. He wanted to give them more power in Ireland. But again, William Gladstone took this to the English Parliament and they refused. They refused to do it. And these issues in Ireland went on and on for another 100+ years. And that's something to really think about when you read this chapter. This caused a lot of unrest within Ireland, okay? Right, now moving on to the second part of our chapter. So the second part of our chapter today is in South Africa, and it's concerning two different main groups. So the first group we've heard about before are the Boers. The Boers are the descendants of the Dutch colonizers who came to South Africa, and the British. Now, if you remember, in the 1880s, there was a big scramble for European countries to take areas of South Africa, which caused a lot of problems. The Dutch, so the Boers, had been there a very long time, about 100 years by this point, and they were quite frustrated that more and more people, especially the British, were taking more and more of the areas. So the British had Cape Colony, which they'd taken from the Dutch, okay? And then the Boers had these two states, Transvaal and the Free State. The British agreed to see these as free states in South Africa and independent states. Now, what happened was there was the Orange River, which ran between the British and the Boers area. At this time, the Boers decided they wanted to be called Afrikaners to show that they were Africans and no longer Dutch. Now, the area where the Orange River was unclaimed. But one day, an Boer or an Afrikaner found a huge diamond by this river. It was the biggest diamond ever found, and still is one of the biggest diamonds to ever be found. It was called the Eureka Diamond. Immediately, when the British heard of this, they took that area. They said, that's our land now. And the Big Hole Mine was created where there was lots and lots of diamonds. Obviously, at this point, the Boers were getting more and more frustrated with the British. And in 1886, in Transvaal, the Boers actually found gold under the ground. This was half of the world's known gold, and they wanted to dig more for it. But mines were expensive, and they realized the people with the most money in the area were the British. So they made a treaty between the Afrikaners and the British. So the British could come into Transvaal and mine for business, but some of that gold had to stay in Transvaal. The money had to go to the people of Transvaal. Now, there was one man who didn't really agree with all this, Cecil Rhodes. He really wanted just the British to take what they wanted. He even made Rhodesia, named after him, which was the area above Transvaal. So at this point, Transvaal and the Free State were surrounded by British colonies. And Cecil Rhodes finally decided he didn't agree with the treaty, and he sent troops into Transvaal to attack, which meant by 1899, it was war. And we call this war the Boers' War, which is named after the people who fought against the British. So you might remember that there was the town of Mafeking. Mafeking was a railroad town that went between British territory and the Boers' territory. The Boers surrounded Mafeking and sieged it. This lasted for 217 days until more British reinforcements came and defended the town. Unfortunately for the Boers, this was the end of the war, and the British ended up winning that war. The British still had a lot of issues with what we call guerrillas, so freedom fighters. who were now called Afrikaners. So they'd moved their name, remember, from being Boers to Afrikaners. The British didn't take this very well, and they decided if anybody lived near any of these Afrikaner guerrillas, these freedom fighters, everyone in the surrounding area and their families would be put into concentration camps. There were two main types of concentration camps. There was around 66 camps for white Africans and around 50 camps for Black Africans. They split them into different concentration camps. Now, the records at this time aren't great, but they believe around 20,000 of the white Africans died and 14,000 Black Africans died at this time. This was horrific for the Afrikaners and the people of Africa, but the British wouldn't stop. They kept going. And in 1902, they finally made a treaty called the Peace of Vereeniging. This treaty meant that the British could take full control of South Africa, and all of those states were blended into one. It said, "We are one nation," and they called it the Union of South Africa. Now, this caused a lot of problems. The Afrikaners were descendants of the Dutch who'd been there many, many years ago. So that meant at this time there was the white British, the Black Africans, and the white Afrikaners living together in South Africa. And just like with Ireland, this led to problems and a lack of peace that would go on for many, many more years to come. All right, well done, everyone. I'll see you next time.